My name is Daniel Whitfield, and for 11 generations, my family has grown wheat, soybeans, and sweet corn on the same 300 acres just outside a town that used to be all farmland before the developers showed up. I want to tell you about the week a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex tried to end my family's farm with a truckload of concrete barriers, and how the entire neighborhood she claimed to protect ended up paying the price for her mistake. If you've ever dealt with someone who mistook a title for actual authority, you're going to enjoy this one. Stick around, because the ending involves a courtroom, a very embarrassed board of directors, and an apology that took 6 months to arrive. I still remember standing at the edge of my own field that week, watching a line of headlights back up half a mile in both directions, and thinking that no amount of community improvement language could disguise what was actually happening. A woman with no legal standing had decided that her personal comfort mattered more than a family's livelihood and, as it turned out, more than the safety of the very people she claimed to be protecting. Let me back up. The road that came before the rooftops. My grandfather bought this land in the 1960s. Back then, there was nothing around us but open fields and a gravel path that everyone in the county called Harvest Road. It wasn't glamorous. It was just a strip of packed dirt and stone, wide enough for a combine and a grain truck to pass through, connecting our fields to the county highway 3 miles east. Every fall, that road carried our entire livelihood out to the co-op elevator. Every spring, it carried seed, fertilizer, and equipment back in. When my grandfather passed the farm to my father, and my father eventually passed it to me, Harvest Road came with it, not as a favor, not as an assumption, but as a legal right. In 1968, the county recorded a permanent ingress-egress easement across what was then open pasture, guaranteeing our family unrestricted access to that road forever, regardless of who owned the land around it. That easement is recorded at the county clerk's office. It has a book number and a page number. It is about as official as a piece of paper can get. Fast forward to about 15 years ago. A developer bought up the pasture land surrounding Harvest Road and built a subdivision called Maple Crest Estates. 240 homes, manicured lawns, a community pool, and, of course, a homeowners association. The road that had once been a quiet farm path was suddenly flanked on both sides by driveways, mailbox clusters, and a steady stream of minivans. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I never had a problem with my new neighbors. Most of them were kind, ordinary families who waved when I drove my tractor past their homes, who apologized when their kids' bikes wandered onto the shoulder, who understood that the combine rumbling through at 6 in the morning during harvest season was simply the sound of the land doing what it had always done. For over a decade, we coexisted just fine. Then, 2 years ago, the HOA elected a new board president. Her name was Linda Castellan. Enter Linda. Linda moved into Maple Crest Estates about 4 years ago, transferring from a large city in our north. She had, by her own repeated description, a background in property management, which I later learned meant she had once worked the front desk of a corporate apartment complex for 18 months. That didn't stop her from treating the HOA presidency like a mayoral office. Within her first year on the board, Linda had already built a local reputation. She fined a family for leaving a garden hose visible from the street. She sent a certified letter to an elderly widow because the wind chimes on her porch were, in Linda's words, audibly excessive. She tried to ban a Girl Scout troop from setting up a cookie table near the community mailboxes because it created unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. Most residents rolled their eyes and paid whatever fine made her go away. It was easier than fighting her. There was also the incident with the mailbox paint colors, which I only mention because it tells you everything about how Linda approached the job. The HOA's guidelines allowed for 3 approved mailbox colors: black, dark green, and bronze. A resident named Sophia Reyes had painted hers a shade the manufacturer called Forest, which was, by any reasonable measure, dark green. Linda disagreed. She measured the mailbox against a paint swatch with a small handheld colorimeter she'd apparently purchased specifically for HOA enforcement, declared the shade borderline non-compliant, and fined Sophia $60. When Sophia appealed, Linda told her the appeal itself would be reviewed at the board's convenience, which turned out to mean 4 months later. Sophia paid the fine just to make it stop. Stories like that circulated through Maple Crest Estates the way stories do in any small community. Half exaggeration, half true, all of it pointing to the same conclusion. Linda didn't see herself as a neighbor managing shared amenities. She saw herself as an authority whose word carried the weight of law, and she seemed genuinely surprised whenever anyone suggested otherwise. I didn't think much about Linda until the day she showed up at my front gate, uninvited, with a folder of printed documents and a tone that suggested she was doing me a tremendous favor by speaking to me at all. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I'm here on behalf of the Maple Crest Estates Homeowners Association regarding the road." I told her Harvest Road wasn't part of the HOA. It never had been. It was county recognized, predated the subdivision by nearly 40 years, and was protected under a recorded easement. She smiled the kind of smile people give when they've already made up their mind and are just waiting for you to stop talking. "That road runs directly past 12 homes in our community," she said. "Residents have complained about noise, dust, and heavy equipment. The board has voted to restrict access." I asked her how, exactly, the board planned to restrict access to a legally recorded easement on land the HOA didn't own. She didn't answer the question. She just handed me the folder, told me to have my lawyer review it, and walked back to her SUV. Looking back, I should have taken that folder more seriously. I filed it in a drawer instead, assuming that no reasonable person, let alone an entire elected board, would actually attempt something so obviously illegal. I was wrong. The barriers. It was the second week of October, right in the middle of soybean harvest, when I got the call from my hired hand, Marcus. His voice had the particular flatness of a man trying not to panic. "Dan," he said, "you need to get down to the east gate. Now." When I arrived, I found 6 enormous concrete jersey barriers, the kind you see dividing highway construction zones, arranged end to end across the entrance to Harvest Road. A crew in reflective vests was still finishing the placement, and standing off to the side, arms crossed, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, was Linda Castellan. "What is this?" I asked her. "The board authorized traffic calming infrastructure," she said, like she was reading from a script, "for the safety of our residents." I pointed out that Harvest Road wasn't a residential street. It was my only access point to 300 acres of standing crop that needed to be harvested that week before a forecasted rain system moved through. I pointed out the recorded easement. I pointed out that blocking it wasn't traffic calming, it was obstruction of a legal right-of-way, and that she had exactly zero authority over land she didn't own. She was unmoved. "You're welcome to submit a formal appeal to the board," she said. "Meetings are the first Tuesday of the month." The first Tuesday of the month was 17 days away. My soybeans would be rotting in the field by then. But here's the part Linda hadn't thought through, the part that turned her power move into a neighborhood-wide catastrophe within about 6 hours. The standstill. Harvest Road wasn't just my access point. Over the years, as Maple Crest Estates expanded, the developer had quietly routed a secondary emergency and utility access lane through the same corridor, specifically because Harvest Road connected directly to the county highway without looping through the subdivision's single main entrance. Most residents didn't know this. I didn't fully know it either, not until that afternoon. At around 4:30, a propane delivery truck servicing homes on the eastern side of Maple Crest tried to use Harvest Road as it always did, and found 6 concrete barriers where a road used to be. The driver had to reverse nearly half a mile before he could turn around, delaying deliveries to 11 homes. At 5:15, a school bus carrying kids from the elementary school attempted its normal route home along Harvest Road, a route the district had used for years because it avoided the subdivision's congested main entrance during pickup hours. The driver found the barriers, had no way to turn a full-size bus around on the narrow shoulder, and had to call dispatch for guidance while 22 children sat waiting, some of them now crying, all of them now late. At 6 o'clock, with the sun starting to dip, a resident named Pete Alvarez, whose wife was 9 months pregnant, tried to leave for what turned out to be an actual hospital run. He hit the barriers too. The main entrance to Maple Crest Estates, it turned out, was backed up nearly to a standstill because of an unrelated water main repair happening on the county highway that same afternoon, a coincidence nobody could have predicted, but one that made Harvest Road, for that single evening, the only remaining way in or out of the neighborhood without a lengthy detour. Word spread through the subdivision fast. Neighbors who had never met me before were suddenly calling my house, asking what on earth was going on with the farm road. I explained, as calmly as I could, that the HOA president had ordered it blocked without my consent, without the county's consent, and without any legal authority to do so. By 7 o'clock, there were nearly 40 cars backed up at both ends of the barrier line, residents trying to get out, delivery drivers trying to get in, and one very frustrated ambulance that had been rerouted after a call came in from a house 2 streets over. The ambulance eventually got through via the long way, but it cost several extra minutes that, thankfully, didn't end up mattering for the patient. It very easily could have. Linda, when confronted by a growing crowd of angry neighbors that evening, reportedly told them the barriers were temporary and that everyone would adjust. Several residents recorded her saying this. Those recordings would matter a great deal, very soon. What struck me most, standing at the edge of that crowd, wasn't the anger. It was the confusion. These were people who had never once thought about Harvest Road as anything other than a slightly noisy strip of pavement that occasionally smelled like fresh-cut hay in the fall. They hadn't realized how much their own daily lives quietly depended on it. The shortcut to the highway that shaved 10 minutes off their commute, the delivery routes, the school bus schedule built around it years before most of them had moved in. Linda had assumed that blocking the farm road would be, at worst, a minor inconvenience to a few people who complained too much about tractors. Instead, she had discovered, in the space of a single evening, just how many invisible threads ran through that one stretch of pavement. Marcus, my hired hand, ended up parking his own truck sideways near the barrier line for a while, headlights on, partly to help drivers see the obstruction in the dimming light and partly, I think, because he wanted Linda to have to look at the mess she'd caused for as long as possible. I don't blame him. I was tempted to do the same thing myself. Fighting back with paper, not anger. I want to say something here, because I think it matters. I was furious. I had a rain system moving in, a field full of soybeans I couldn't reach, and a woman who had unilaterally decided my family's 40-year-old legal right meant nothing to her. But I didn't drive a truck through those barriers. I didn't shout at Linda in front of the crowd, tempting as it was. I did what my father always told me to do when someone tries to bully you with false authority. I went and got real authority of my own. That night, I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and reported that a private entity had obstructed a county-recognized easement, creating what was now a documented public safety hazard, given the school bus and ambulance incidents. A deputy came out within the hour, took photos, and confirmed on record that the barriers were, in fact, blocking a legally protected right-of-way. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and pulled a certified copy of the original 1968 easement. I also pulled the subdivision's own recorded plat maps, which, and this was the detail that ended up mattering most, explicitly listed Harvest Road as a protected access corridor, not subject to HOA governance, a clause the original developer had been legally required to include specifically because of my family's easement. In other words, the HOA hadn't just broken county law. They had violated their own governing documents, documents Linda herself, as board president, was legally obligated to have read. I hired a real estate attorney that same afternoon. Within 2 hours, he had drafted a cease and desist letter demanding the immediate removal of the barriers, citing obstruction of a recorded easement, interference with emergency services, and potential liability for crop loss, which, given the rain system bearing down on us, was no longer a hypothetical. The emergency meeting. The letter went out by courier and email at 9 the next morning. By noon, I received a call, not from Linda, but from the HOA's actual legal counsel, a soft-spoken man named Greg who sounded like he'd been having a very long week already. He asked, almost apologetically, whether I would be willing to attend an emergency board meeting that evening instead of pursuing immediate legal action. I agreed, mostly because removing the barriers quickly mattered more to me than winning a fight on principle. My soybeans didn't care about principle. They cared about rain. The meeting was packed. Word had gotten around the neighborhood, and easily 60 residents showed up, far more than the HOA's usual attendance of maybe 8 people arguing about pool hours. Pete Alvarez was there, his wife safely home with their new daughter, born the very night of the barrier standoff. She'd made it to the hospital in time, but barely, and he had plenty to say about it. The school bus driver's supervisor had sent a formal written complaint that Greg read aloud. The propane company had already emailed the HOA threatening to drop Maple Crest Estates as a service area entirely if unauthorized obstructions continued. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I laid the certified easement copy on the table, along with the subdivision's own plat map showing Harvest Road's protected status, and I read the clause aloud so there could be no confusion. Harvest Road was never, at any point, under HOA authority. Then I asked Linda, directly, in front of the entire room, whether she had read the governing documents before ordering 6 concrete barriers installed at a cost that, as it turned out, had come out of the HOA Shared Reserve Fund, without a proper vote of the full membership, which their own bylaws required for any expenditure over $2,000. She didn't have an answer right away. She started to say something about board discretion in matters of community safety, but Greg, sitting beside her, quietly cleared his throat in a way that suggested he'd like her to stop talking. She didn't take the hint immediately. These barriers were a necessary response to resident complaints, she said, turning to address the room rather than me. I don't think it's fair to characterize this as. How many complaints? Asked Carol Jennings, the retired schoolteacher who at that point was just another resident sitting in the third row. Because I've lived here 6 years and I never once heard a formal complaint about that road at a meeting. Linda didn't have a number. It turned out, when Greg later reviewed the HOA's own complaint log as part of his review, that there had been exactly 2 informal comments about the road over the previous 18 months, both about dust in dry weather, neither requesting anything close to a full closure. Greg, the attorney, did have an answer to my original question. He confirmed, on record, that the expenditure violated the HOA's own spending rules, and that the barrier installation exposed the association to serious legal liability given the documented emergency vehicle delays. The barriers come down. The board voted that same night, 6-1, to have the barriers removed immediately, with Linda casting the lone dissenting vote. The removal crew came out the following morning. I stood at the gate and watched as, one by one, the same barriers that had sealed off my family's livelihood were lifted away by the same machine that had placed them 3 days earlier. I lost about 18 acres of soybeans to the rain that moved through during the delay. Not everything, thankfully, but enough to sting. I later learned that under state law, obstruction of a recorded easement resulting in demonstrable financial loss is grounds for a civil claim, and my attorney encouraged me to pursue it. Rather than dragging the HOA as a whole through a lawsuit, which would have ultimately been funded by ordinary residents who'd had nothing to do with Linda's decision, I chose to pursue a claim specifically against the board's insurance policy covering director liability, on the basis that Linda had acted outside her authority and against the association's own bylaws. It settled quietly a few months later, covering the crop loss along with the legal fees. What happened to Linda? Here's where the story does what these stories tend to do. At the HOA's annual election 2 months later, Linda ran for re-election as board president. She lost, decisively, to a soft-spoken retired schoolteacher named Carol Jennings, who ran on the simple platform of reading the bylaws before making decisions. Linda didn't just lose the presidency. Residents voted to remove her from the board entirely, using a provision in the HOA's charter that allowed for removal in cases of material breach of fiduciary duty, which the barrier incident, and the improperly authorized spending, satisfied without much debate. Under Carol's leadership, the new board sent me a formal written apology, on HOA letterhead, acknowledging that Harvest Road had never been subject to their authority and committing, in writing, to respecting the easement permanently going forward. Carol also personally came out to the farm to see the fields for herself, which I appreciated more than the letter, honestly. She stayed for coffee and asked good questions about how harvest scheduling actually worked, which was more curiosity than Linda had shown in 4 years of living 2 miles from a working farm. As for Linda, she moved out of Maple Crest Estates about 8 months after losing her board seat. I don't know exactly where she went, and I try not to spend much time thinking about it. The neighbors who remained, though, seemed to breathe a little easier without a certified letter in their mailbox every other week. I heard, secondhand, that Linda tried to run for a board seat in her new community almost immediately after moving in. Whether that's true, I can't say for certain, and it's not really my business either way. What I do know is that Carol's new board spent their first few months in office simply going through the HOA's old files, quietly reversing several fines that residents had paid under Linda's tenure for things like garden hoses, wind chimes, and mailbox shades of green that were, by any sane measure, already within the rules. Sophia Reyes got her $60 back, along with a short note from Carol that just said, "This should never have happened. Sorry it took so long to fix." The propane company, once they confirmed in writing that the obstruction had been permanently resolved, agreed to continue servicing the neighborhood without penalty. The school district quietly restored Harvest Road to its original bus route the following week, and as far as I know, no child has been late coming home because of a concrete barrier since. Part 9. The Harvest After. The following October, almost exactly a year after the barrier incident, I brought the combine down Harvest Road at 6 in the morning, same as always, dust rising gold in the early light. A few of my neighbors, the same ones who'd once been stuck behind those concrete barriers, waved from their driveways as I passed. One of them, a guy named Ted who lived in the second house from the corner, jogged out with a thermos of coffee and asked if he could ride along in the cab for 20 minutes before work, just to see what harvest actually looked like up close. I let him. He asked a lot of questions: how the header worked, how I knew when the beans were dry enough, why we ran so early before the dew burned off. It was the kind of ordinary curiosity that had been completely absent the year before, when most people on that street had never given the farm a second thought except to complain about dust on their cars. Somewhere in the middle of all that mess with Linda, the road had stopped being invisible to them. They'd learned, the hard way, exactly what it carried and why it mattered, and something about that seemed to change how they saw the whole farm, not just the road running past it. We didn't talk about Linda. We didn't need to. The road was just a road again, doing exactly what it had done for over half a century, carrying the harvest home, one load at a time. Epilogue. If there's a lesson in all of this, I think it's a simple one. A title on a board doesn't grant you authority you were never given, and paperwork always tells the truth, even when people don't want to hear it. Linda Castellan had a folder full of intimidation and a truckload of concrete. I had a piece of paper from 1968 and a county clerk's office that kept excellent records. In the end, that was more than enough. I don't share this story to gloat, and I don't think Linda was ever truly a villain in the way some of the more dramatic retellings around the neighborhood made her out to be. I think she genuinely believed, for whatever reason, that the position she held gave her more power than it actually did, and she never stopped to check before acting. That's a mistake plenty of people make, in HOAs and everywhere else. The difference is that most of those mistakes don't end up backing up an ambulance, delaying a school bus full of children, and costing 18 acres of soybeans. Some mistakes come with real consequences, and it's worth remembering that before you reach for the concrete barriers, literal or otherwise. Thanks for watching. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that overstepped, or a neighbor who thought a title meant they could rewrite the rules, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you are subscribed, because there are plenty more where this came from.